Good evening. Good evening, friends and guests. My name is Chase Robinson, and as president of the Graduate Center, I have the privilege of welcoming you here to this glorious event on a glorious day to celebrate and understand an important new book. It's an understatement to say that Americans are dissatisfied with government's problem-solving abilities, especially as they relate to some of our biggest dilemmas: shoring up Social Security, taming the deficit, reining in Wall Street, making healthcare and education more affordable, and addressing inequality especially. Jim Stone takes on all of these issues in his bold new book, which he'll cover in depth with New York Times columnist Eduardo Porter. The themes at issue tonight resonate at CUNY, which can itself be viewed as an extraordinary project in reducing inequality and increasing opportunity. It bears repeating what I mentioned at our globalization and inequality event last month. Of the university's undergraduates, 42% are the first in their families to attend college. A full 40% of CUNY undergraduates come from households with annual incomes below $20,000 a year. Some of you know that the Graduate Center, which focuses on, as its name would suggest, graduate education and advanced teaching and research, it's a crucial part of that project. Every year, our doctoral students reach about 200,000 undergraduates in CUNY's classrooms and labs. And this institution, I'm very proud to say, is becoming a leading venue for empirical research on socioeconomic inequalities. We can boast top researchers and experts. We can boast the satellite office of the world's most important income database and resource, the Luxembourg Income Study Center, or LIS. We can boast a rapidly growing cohort of PhD students using the LIS data, and we can boast all manner of collaborations, both national and international. For that reason, I couldn't be more delighted to host tonight's conversation, especially in light of some special news, and that special news is the great pleasure that I have in announcing a gift that Jim and his wife, Kathy Stone, have made to the Graduate Center. The Stones' gift will fund a lecture series about wealth inequality with a focus on the accumulation and the sequestering of wealth by the most affluent. The James M. and Kathleen D. Stone lecture series on wealth inequality will be overseen by LIS, and the lectures will be presented annually by distinguished scholars with expertise in wealth inequality. Next year, the inaugural lecturer will be none other than Gabriel Zuckman of the University of California at Berkeley, who's the author of a widely reviewed and much praised book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, The Scourge of Tax Havens. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Janet Gornick, professor of political science and sociology and director of the LIS Center. For over 30 years, Janet has been a leading researcher and educator in the field of American social welfare policy, especially as it affects the economic status of women and families. Her book, Families That Work, has been widely used in teaching for over a decade. Her most recent book, co-edited with Marcus Yanti, is Income Inequality, Economic Disparities, and the Middle Class in Affluent Countries. Thank you again for joining us, and Janet, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Chase. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers this evening. Jim Stone earned his PhD in economics at Harvard and began his career teaching economics. He then took a lengthy foray into what we call the real world, serving in government in two crucial positions. He served as the Massachusetts Insurance Commissioner from 1975 to 1979 and then as chairman and commissioner of the U.S. Commodities Future Trading Commission for 4 years. He's now the founder, chairman, and CEO of the Plymouth Rock Group of Companies, which are based in Boston. I met Jim 2 years ago through a mutual colleague who's here. And since then, we've had many conversations about economic inequalities and also about the complexities and the importance of building data capacity and structuring targeted research, especially aimed at uncovering hidden elements, those unknown components in the story of wealth accumulation. And I've really learned a great deal from our exchanges. So all of us at the LIS Center and at the Graduate Center are really delighted to have the opportunity to host Jim this evening as he talks about his new book. And we're also delighted to see the remarkable response that the book has gotten. It rose instantly to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And although that's really a tremendous achievement, I have to say I actually was not all that surprised. I had the honor of writing one of the blurbs on the book, a jacket blurb, and I described the book as masterfully written, straightforward, and free of jargon, and it is indeed all three of those. It's really a marvelous read. And of course, I want to echo Chase's remarks about the gift given to the Graduate Center by Jim and Kathy Stone that will allow us to establish next year, as we noted, this annual annual lecture series on wealth and equality, and it's really our pleasure to have them both with us this evening. And with their support, we really look forward to what will be an annual lecture series covering wealth, specifically wealth inequalities, and from multiple angles. And I know also I speak for Chase and others at the Graduate Center when I say that our hope is that this lecture series will help to inform and deepen public understanding of the causes and the nature and the consequences of wealth inequality. I'm also very happy to introduce Eduardo Porter, who's a great friend to the Graduate Center and to the LIS Center as well. He sits on one of our advisory boards at the Graduate Center. He's appeared on our stages many times, helping our audiences to sort out economic fact from fiction and important necessity, especially these days, and he's generously met with our students. Eduardo began his career in journalism over 20 years ago as a financial reporter, and since then he's written from many parts of the globe, including from Mexico and Brazil, Japan, and the United Kingdom, and further. More recently, he served as a member of the Times editorial board, where he wrote about business and economics and related matters, and today he writes the Economic Scene column for the Times. Eduardo's background helps to explain his keen eye and unique analytic skills. He has a degree in physics, and he has a degree in quantum fields and fundamental forces. I have absolutely no idea what that means, but I've always been very impressed by it. So welcome, Jim, and welcome, Eduardo.
Thank you for those kind introductions. As I think you just heard, my book deals with 5 topics, any one of which could be a lecture of this length, but only one of them fits the purpose of LIS, and only one of them fits the time allotted tonight. So tonight, I'm going to talk about one of the 5 topics I'm really interested in, and that is inequality. So ours is an exceptional society, admirable for many reasons. I learned that quite young. One of the indicia of our exceptionalism I was told about was that the United States had a high level of distributional equity and social mobility, in contrast to Latin American plutocracies, European hereditary aristocracies, South Asian caste-based societies, and despotic kingdoms wherever they exist. Ours, in fact, was one of the most admirable societies in the world by those measures. The pride that resonated in my young soul was just about the fine, it was at the top because it's about the finest boast a nation can make. And tragically, and I don't use that word tragically lightly, it's no longer true. There's still plenty for America to be proud of, but our country is losing the right to crow about its contribution to fundamental decency reflected in its equitable distribution of income and wealth. It had it, it's lost it. Economic equality in our country is in danger of receding into the status of a national myth rather than a descriptor. We've become in contradiction of our commendable values among the least equal nations in the developed world in the distribution of wealth and income, and those disparities are growing. We're not the only country experiencing this kind of challenge. There are others. It is true that some of the surviving kingdoms and empires have never put a value on equitable distribution. The United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada are racing behind us on the same track that we're on. The other European powers, including Germany and France, are a lap behind, but headed in the same direction. Russia and China, which were not very long ago revolutionary egalitarian regimes, seem to be reinventing wealth and income gaps. The United States, though, bears the dubious distinction of developed world leadership in the growth of inequality by a solid length. This is doubly unfortunate, owing to our special place as the economic frontrunner and role model for the rest of the world. This drift, if not stayed, will carry us away from meritocracy, productivity, empathy, and mobility. It would ultimately deprive us of our democracy and social cohesion, if not curbed. There's a great deal of talk in 2016 about angry voters in this election year. You don't really need to look beyond income and wealth statistics to understand why. Even if voters don't know some of the facts, they can feel their impacts. I'd attribute the power of the Occupy Wall Street movement a few years ago on the left and the Tea Party movement on the right in part to the same underlying economic truths. While statistics probably should be avoided in this kind of setting, I can't resist offering a few. The most powerful fact, perhaps, and simplest to absorb, is that the real median income in this country hasn't risen for about 40 years. The United States in that period has harvested a prodigious bounty of wealth, but these fruits have been increasingly impounded at the top of the economic pyramid. As recently as the middle of the 20th century, the share of the United States national income taken by the top 10% of income earners was about a third. Now it's 50%. While income in the middle brackets stagnated over the past 4 decades, income for the upper 1% tripled. The fortunate pinnacle, and that's the top 1% of households, received about 10% of the nation's total income in the middle of the 20th century. Now it's about a quarter of the total. Recent statistics are actually worse. Since 2000, income for 70% or more of Americans has actually been flat or maybe declined a little. Meanwhile, income for the top decile is up by double digits despite the 2008 crash. The average net worth of households in the upper 7% rose by 28% in the initial recovery years, 2009 through 11, while the wealth of the other 93% fell by 4%. It should not be surprising that a lot of people think the recession isn't over yet and that a lot of people are angry. If you're in the lucky segment, I hope you can be grateful without believing for a minute that this is the way things ought to be. The data on wealth as opposed to income is less available to the public and harder to interpret, but the inequalities of wealth are much greater than the inequalities of income, and more significant. The top 1% of income earners make roughly 14 times the median income. The top 1% by wealth, 70 times the median household wealth. Those at the summit, the top 1% of 1%, had a combined worth of $6 trillion in 2012, probably $9 trillion today, which is greater than the wealth of the entire bottom 2/3 of the population. Yet wealth, even more than income, determines socioeconomic class, and wealth is more directly portable to the next generation than income. Its differentials are more durable and consequently more pernicious when extreme. Some political economists will tell you that wealth and income disparities don't matter very much because large distinctions in a mobile society spur ambition to succeed. But America is becoming less mobile as well. The American dream has always embodied an assumption that able and hardworking citizens can move upward freely from one class to the next, and that sloth or incompetence will lead to a downward income shift. This is less true than it used to be, and it will be less so as concentration at the pinnacle vacuums the opportunity from the spaces below. More wealth held tightly in the hands of fewer families implies a diminishing reward for hard, honest work on the part of everybody else. By John Rawls' notion that a just society is one in virtually all would sign off on the economic distribution pattern in advance of knowing which decile you're going to be in, ours is becoming less just by the year. A Federal Reserve study recently compared outcomes at age 40 for college graduates born to families in the lowest 20% of the income distribution to outcomes for high school dropouts raised in the highest income quintile. The two groups had about the same likelihood of ending up at 40 in the lowest income quintile. And the odds that the bootstrapping college graduate would reach the top quintile, despite all talent, grit, and struggle, were no better than the odds that the well-heeled dropouts would remain comfortably in one of the two top quintiles. This is far from the profile of a meritocracy, and it casts a cloud over the widely held belief that education is a magical key sufficient to assure a positive outcome. Yeah, it's true. A strong education can elevate you to a higher position on the income ladder, but no more reliably than having, along with a truncated education, a prosperous parent. Such is the nature of aristocracies, and aristocracies tend to be neither morally acceptable nor economically productive. Now, I'd be oversimplifying if I didn't acknowledge that there's some academic debate about how much mobility has decreased. Some economists have compared individual positions on the income hierarchy with later placement and found that there's movement. They claim to have found evidence that healthy social mobility must exist because the rankings of individuals at the ends of the study aren't the same as at the beginning of the study. Trouble is that this kind of measurement ignores the wealth and income walled off from most of society at the top. Think about the Dark Ages, when a feudal aristocracy of nobles and clergymen kept everything for itself. Did it really matter in that environment whether mobility was sufficiently fluid that some serf could move from the bottom decile to the middle? The consequences of that kind of upgrade are depressingly inconsequential, while the consequences of concentration at the top included 1,000 years of illiteracy, stagnation, and abject poverty. The cast iron truth is that the greater the share of the nation's wealth and income impounded and sequestered by a durable elite, the less mobility will matter to anyone else. And sequestration of wealth, that's what I call it, characterizes all too well the direction our country, unfortunately, is headed. Now, there's an active debate today about whether the minimum wage should be increased. That and other wage policies are important, as is the ability of education and the affordability of education. I mean in no way to minimize the value of those significant debates, and I applaud the scholars who shed light on them, but these are not the focus of my interest recently. My focus is specifically on the sequestration of wealth at the top, because I believe this to be the subpart of the equality debate that is most under-examined over the years and the principal determinant of how much value can be realized by adjusting those middle and lower income shares. I fail to see how anti-poverty programs and modest adjustments to the wage distribution, however well-intentioned, can free up a meaningful portion of that wealth which is increasingly sequestered at the top. Unless attention is paid to that problem, as well as mobility enhancement, the middle and lower economic classes will continue to be painfully and progressively squeezed. Although it is not my focus tonight, this conversation would be incomplete if I didn't at least touch on corporate concentration as well as individual wealth concentration. You're not an alarmist if you feel that corporate lobbyists have excessive influence nowadays in politics. Corporate power in the halls of Congress is probably greater now than at any time since the robber baron era. It's a reasoned guess that effective concentration in American business has risen in the past 50 years, but it's certain that influence on politics and corporate lobbying is up. Bigger money is spent on campaign contributions than in lobbying, and that's an increasingly protected form of free speech. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, we should expect not only more spending by corporations seeking advantages from government, but less visibility with respect to the amount spent on doing this. It's hard to read this trend as other than a blessing for a stronger corporate hand in politics, and I don't think that's a good trend. Democracy itself can be endangered by this. Our treasured form of government is nothing anyone should take for granted. The more you learn about history and about governments around the world, the more grateful you should be for the accomplishment of a democracy, and the more clearly you should discern what a delicate flower democracy is. Were there no other reason for concern about widening wealth and income gaps, the multifaceted adverse impact on democracy would be sufficient. One threat lies in outright destabilization. Another is in alienation from civic participation. People can lose their faith in major parties. They may turn to candidates with extravagant, heroic promises, the men on horseback who've heralded so much of history's pain. Crime becomes more attractive to those who feel left out. And maybe most of all, if future economic gains are not shared with the middle class, America will lose its unifying spirit embodied in its social and political cohesion that was necessary to make it the great nation that it is today. At its fundamental core, democracy requires as a precondition a healthy measure of pluralism, an underlying society with a wide distribution of money, influence, and power. Although they are nicely symbiotic, democracy and a prosperous market economy are not the same. America's attachment to a market economy is relatively robust, and its prosperity, I believe, is secure as long as we can maintain our culture of challenge and innovation. The threat is that we may find ourselves in a market economy where a tiny fraction of the people and a small number of institutions reap virtually all the rewards and make all the social and economic policy decisions, presumably with a bias towards serving their own interest. This would be a democracy in name only. A true democracy is surely not the most natural form of government for human beings, and perhaps it's only barely compatible with human nature, but it may be mankind's greatest invention. And the growing degree of concentration of wealth and power in our individual and corporate sectors threatens democracy's vitality. If pluralism erodes, America's brightest gem will lose its luster in lockstep. I'm often asked as I talk about these trends towards greater inequality whether its causes are reversible. Well, the underlying causes are in fact many and varied. One of the causes has something to do with education. You know, there's been an inadvertent segregation of our elite into an increasingly cohesive and permanent upper class that's resulted from the fact that the most prestigious colleges have gotten better as communications and transportation improved at attracting the best students from all over to their campuses. Those students link up with each other and often for life. And this magnet effect, rooted in an admirable search for excellence, has necessarily promoted the exaggeration of hereditary class distinctions. But another causal factor is the expansion of the knowledge-based economy, which tends to exclude much of the population from the best-paid jobs. Add to this the multiplier effect of modern financial practices. In hunter-gatherer societies, the best hunter or gatherer was only slightly better fed than the average member of the tribe. Much later, the most skilled farmer could be several times more productive and prosperous than a neighbor. Millennia after that, a preeminent industrialist could be dozens of times, or maybe 100 times more productive than a laborer. But today, with nearly unlimited financial leverage, compounding financial gains and losses, and vast corporations or groups of corporations governed by tiny numbers of leaders, a top dog can bring in thousands or millions of times what the other hounds produce. Technology, moreover, is an inevitable driver in income and wealth shifts. No one seriously argues, and I'm certainly not going to argue, that we should use less of it, but it's proven a double-edged sword. Everyone can gain from the larger pie that technology creates, but the use of more capital and protected knowledge relative to labor may tilt the return towards the owners of those technological advantages. Thomas Piketty's book focuses on another explanation for migration to the top. He observes that the population as a whole can see its financial posture improve only at the growth rate of the economy, while the wealthier see gains tied to the appreciation of investment assets, which substantially exceed overall growth. Globalization is also a factor. The declining importance of national borders has tilted the overall balance of power from the public to businesses, which often transcend national boundaries and may have little or no concern for host nations' internal issues. Modern corporations are too able to shift assets and questioned operations to compliant jurisdictions when pushed hard at home, and they're increasingly less pushed. It goes without saying that powerful corporations will have more say in shaping the rules to their advantage than smaller entities. But finally, there's poor domestic legislation and policy. Some of the forces leading to wealth concentration are intrinsic to a modern economy. Perverted policies that favor the accumulation of great wealth and its passage intact through the generations. That is not inevitable. It's policy and law we must change. We must use it to dampen the other vectors, and instead, too many of our laws tend to magnify those impacts. I hope that the case against the country's rising concentration of wealth at the top is pretty obvious. It's a threat to decency and fairness, a threat to democracy, and a threat to future prosperity as well. Oligarchies and aristocracies tend to be inefficient economic engines. When prosperity is not shared, education and opportunity don't get shared well either, and much of an economy's wasted, potential talent is wasted. Top-heavy systems are prone to stalling out. It's behind realistic imagination that a hereditary economic aristocracy can be a friend of the innovation and healthy competition that underlies economic growth. So you may fairly wonder about the solutions, but I can only offer a glimpse in the time that's allotted. Let me say that what I believe is required by way of solutions is not easily going to come from political leaders. We are asking them to swim upstream, to swim against the interests of their largest contributors, which is a very difficult thing for politicians to do. But the longer we wait to change these things, the harder it's going to be to change them. So there are two general areas where I would love to see a major shift in policy. One is, I think that we should cut back on the financialization of the economy. The financial sector and the industrial sector are not the same thing, and finance in excess thrives at the expense of industry. Finance should be like a lubricant, a few drops, good in the machinery, a barrel is not good. It can be done, but it can only be done if we do something to put an end to tax policies that favor debt over equity, and we can do that. Those are easy things to do if there were the political will to do it. A second necessary paradigm shift relates to individual taxation. The unpopularity of the death tax, that's what it's sometimes called, is a rare violation of the notion that the electoral public is wiser than those it elects. That's something I usually believe. In this case, it's wrong. The gift and estate tax is a levy whose logic is as solid as its historical roots. It's probably the fairest form of all taxation. And you know, there's a $10.8 million exemption per couple. So what are you worried about when people say they can't pass on a small business or a family farm? Of course you can. But the exemption's not the worst hole in the estate tax structure. The worst is trusts. Now, trusts have a good reason to exist. If you have, for example, a child who is disabled or a wounded war veteran and you want to take care of that child and be sure that child is going to be okay, a trust is great. But you know, that's not what it's used for. If you believe that that's what the majority of trusts are used for, you've been sold a pretty sketchy bill of goods. In fact, trusts allow hundreds of millions, billions, tens of billions of dollars to be passed on from one generation to the next without tax, and there is absolutely no reason why that should be. Now, we can change all of that, but these changes run counter to the prevailing political winds. They do, on the other hand, represent an essential step on the path to restoring the country in which you, like me, were probably proud to have grown up or chose to make your own. It's wise to be wary when someone claims to channel the wishes of the country's founding fathers. But I want to make that claim anyway. The founding fathers of the United States of America would roll over in their graves if forced to witness the growing substitution of bloodlines for merit as the determinant of success in the United States. I want to close with a reassurance that this is not a call for a utopian agenda. I have no illusions that perfection of our species, no matter what we do about this issue, is even remotely possible. Rather, I accept Immanuel Kant's dictum on human nature that out of such crooked timber nothing straight can be built. I only seek results no more cockeyed than they need to be, and there's plenty of space between the best constructed human societies and the worst. Similarly, there's no need even to contemplate a radically egalitarian economy in which everybody's paid the same. On that score, I want to quote a contemporary Kantian figure, E.O. Wilson, who said of such complete leveling, "Great idea, wrong species." There's room for argument about where the balance should be struck between a pure meritocracy, which can be unduly harsh on those with low starting endowments of various sorts, and a leveled society, which risks trading prosperity for equality if taken too far. But neither a mercilessly pure meritocracy nor the far edge of the egalitarian flat plane is a sound destination for America. It is by finding the proper equilibrium that we can set a course far, far better than the one we find ourselves on today. These problems are monumental, and a practical political path to their solution is as yet undiscovered, but don't be dispirited. The topic of widening income and wealth was virtually unstudied in academic until recently, and studied mainly when it was only with respect to the roots of persistent poverty, and it was absent from political campaigns. The silver lining to the clouds of manifestly growing inequality is that political and scholarly attention is finally being paid to it, and participation in that scholarly exploration, as well as the healthy political activism necessary to turn knowledge into action, represents exactly what I urge upon you tonight. Thank you.
Hi. Hey. Well, that was great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
And congratulations for the book. I hear it's doing fantastic, and hopefully the message is going to get out there very broadly.
It's an exciting project to have taken on.
So, I was interested in reading your book, and especially the chapter about inequality. So, the contrast between how big and momentous and historical the problem is, but also in some sense how narrow it is and how narrow a solution can be crafted. I was looking at the numbers from Piketty, Size, and Suckman on wealth distribution. You're talking about 160,000 families who control 22% of the nation's wealth. That's the 0.1% of the population. That amounts to about $73 million per family. Now, your proposal, if I understand correctly, which seems kind of technically quite simple at the end of the day, just tax that when it's passed from one generation to the next. I'm astonished that stuff that I didn't know about because I don't have the wealth to care, but in reading your book, I discovered that, unrealized gains are not taxed, and they can go through from generation to generation without ever hitting the taxman. And there are many other tricks. But just essentially ensuring that this wealth gets taxed somewhere along the way could really move the dial. If you start thinking aggressively, some back-of-the-envelope calculations, 22% of the nation's wealth is about 12 trillion. Say, you get aggressive and you tax, tax 20% of it, you could get to Scandinavian levels of taxation. That's Norway right there. You can pay for universal childhood education, early childhood education, all sorts of things, and we would start looking Scandinavian. But I wanted to push back, and you sort of alluded to that in your speech right now, to one of the words in your title, which is the word easy. Because even though I think that your ideas are quite straightforward technically, there is the issue of putting them into our political system, putting them into the society. And that led me to think, well, when in our history have we ever achieved anything of this kind of ambition? And my sense is that, other than war, we don't know of anything that'll push us in this sort of direction. So I once wrote a column about this, trying to think, well, does democracy deliver solutions to the kind of inequality that we've got? And so I looked through our history, looked back hopefully at the progressive era where we got great things. We got the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Act, they bust up the Rockefeller oil monopoly. We got the first income tax. Ford increased wages to $5 a day, which was at the time doubling the wage of his workers. So great things happened. And yet, still, in terms of redistribution, nothing happened. I mean, we raised virtually no tax revenue after that. And it was only until we hit the war. And you started seeing flyers, political advertisements, and things that started using the theme, conscription of wealth and income. The idea that since we're sending, the poor to die, it only makes sense, it's only fair if we can get some of your money to pay for it. But other than that, it's hard to find something that would sway our political system in that direction. And specifically thinking about the estate tax, which is you bring up in your proposal, I was looking at some numbers from Ken Shivey and David Stasevich, who just wrote this really book with a great title called Taxing the Rich. They noticed, well, estate tax revenues have been 1 to 2% of our federal taxes for the past, 5-6 decades. So the notion that we can really get more from that runs against, well, a lot of precedent. We've had rates as high as 77% from 1940 to 1976. And still, not only did we really fail to raise a lot of revenue from that, but the top share of wealth didn't change at all. The top share of wealth has been about 1/3, the top 1% has captured about 1/3 of the wealth since the 1940s, and it's pretty much a straight line. Mm-hmm. So, this might be a bit of an unfair question, but I was hoping that you might give a sense of what your thoughts are about what could motivate our political system to accept some of these changes or start moving in this direction.
Well, there are maybe two parts, as I see it, to what you just asked. One has to do with whether these things are possible in our kind of political system, and the other is whether they're really possible at all. And so on the issue of whether they're possible at all, I'm an optimist. I do believe that different societies around the world get different results. None of them are perfect, but you can get different results. There are fairer societies, and in fact, we had one, as I said, when I was younger. It's not an extreme, you can't cross, from terrible to perfection, but you can get better by degree. So I'm optimistic that it could be done if there were the political will. So that gets to the other half of it. And the only thing I can say about that is, there was that wonderful, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but that wonderful quote by John Maynard Keynes when somebody said to him, testifying before a British parliamentary inquiry, well, you're only an academic economist. And he said, don't you know, sir, that parliamentarians are all slaves of dead economists? Well, if you change the thinking about an issue, which is what I try to do by writing a book and what you do for a living, then there's some hope that eventually it works its way into the political system. It's not that the leaders bring it about, it's that the public forces it because you've changed the paradigm, you've changed the thinking in the public about what's fair and just. And that's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen in 2016, but if you don't write about it and I don't write about it, well, then it never happens.
So I guess maybe we just wait for the pitchforks. In fact, there is this guy, there's this venture capitalist hedge fund dude called Nick Hanauer, who's super rich, and he's made these little coffee mugs that have the slogan "Trickle Down Economics," making the poor poorer and the rich richer forever. And he wrote a piece in Politico magazine maybe a year, 2 years ago, which actually was a call to his fellow plutocrats. And the title was, "The Pitchforks Are Coming." And you do wonder, I mean, I always thought this was an idea that I had in my head. Well, is there a Jacobin moment? And the kind of like Rhoda answer that I got, I never was very satisfied, was, well, no, we don't get the Jacobins because in the United States, even though there is enormous inequality, there is growth and aspiration at the bottom. There's this sense of opportunity, there's this sense of mobility. But now, I mean, you start looking back and you look at the stats over one decade, over two, as you pointed out in your speech, and you're thinking, well, no, this mobility doesn't seem to be there, and the sense of opportunity doesn't seem to have gone. So perhaps the pitchforks are in our future.
Well, can I respond to the pitchforks thought? Because, yeah, there have been revolutions. They often don't turn out very well. Idealists begin them, and then some people with harsher notions take them over. But those revolutions have tended to occur where you have tremendous inequality and a totally inflexible government. And then you get the need to fight that government because you demonstrate and they kill the demonstrators or whatever. We do have the blessing of having a democracy. That's a rare thing. It's not where you've had these revolutions. And so we can change by evolution. And that's what you hope. And so what we have to hope is that, yeah, it's a test of democracy, a big test. Because on one hand, you do have vested interests and money and campaign contributions count. But on the other hand, the public does have the right to overrule the vested interests. I've sometimes said that it's like having a two-house legislature, a two-house system. There's the House of Vested Interests, and the House of Vested Interests gets to rule most of the time. But the other house, the House of Voters, can overrule it any time it gets its act together. And so we do have that steam valve that makes a revolution less likely, less necessary. And again, as an optimist, I think the public can rise up and say, we want a fairer society.
Well, in fact, if you think of the evolution of the social insurance in some of the social democracies in Europe, part of the motivation for these systems, like pensions and so forth, comes from having the example of a revolution right next door, which is the Soviet Revolution. And so there's this sense of, well, we want to save capitalism from revolution, and hence we must do something in order to assuage these tensions within our societies. And presumably that kind of argument, I mean, not that there is an example that next door, I mean, the Soviet model has quite rightly collapsed. But perhaps there's this sense of a need to save capitalism from itself. We don't have Soviet Union, but we have Donald Trump running as a Republican.
Well, there's a need to save democracy from too much influence of money, because that combination of concentration of wealth and increasing influence of that wealth on our politics, that's pernicious. That's the dangerous thing. That undermines democracy. And I do think Americans love democracy. And so it is possible that the public will rise up and overrule all of the interests that are in the other direction. But again, it's only possible, and if people study it, if people talk about it, if it becomes an issue that reaches the public. And I'm, only hopeful that will happen. But there are more signs of that in this campaign than there are in any previous one that I remember.
Yeah, although, I mean, just to, to be a little more pessimistic, as usual, you think about it this way, the Obama administration has probably been the most redistributionist in a very, very long time. From the increases in the marginal income tax rates, which included the ACA tax, plus the ACA, which has an important redistributive component, and still, so I don't think we've seen anything like this since Lyndon Johnson, certainly. And yet the effect on the overall trends is looks a little bit like a rounding error. I mean, this is unfair, but that's kind of like what it looks like.
Well, I want to stay somewhat out of politics, but I can't resist saying that of the three parts of government, the administration has been the best of the three. The Supreme Court has not helped with these issues, and the Congress has helped less. Well, they can compete with one another for which one's helped less on these issues. The administration has been fine, and I think that if this administration had been able to do what it wanted on these issues, that we would have made a great deal more progress. Lyndon Johnson had that, and Barack Obama didn't.
So now, moving to perhaps another issue, you have sort of like two components broadly in your proposal. One is, redistribution on a fairly large scale through the taxation of wealth, but you also allude to the idea of working with market incomes, and this reminds me of something that Robert Solow once told me. He felt that redistribution really wouldn't cut it. The concentration of income is way too intense to deal with it through taxes and transfers, and we needed to somehow affect the market distribution of incomes. And some of your ideas certainly go along this way. Addressing the hyper-financialization of society is one of them. And in your book, you also mention increasing rents and monopolization. And I mean, there's other things that you might consider perhaps less important, but for instance, union power, which might help the distribution of rents between workers and owners of capital, benefit workers slightly more. I'd love to. I don't know if you've parsed it, if you've tried to figure out how big a role each of these components play.
Yeah, I don't know how to measure that, but I want to stipulate at the outset that if Robert Solow said that to you, it's probably right. He's my academic hero among economists who look at these issues. I think he's just an extraordinary human being and thinker. But let me say that there are structural changes that can be made. One of the things that has increased inequality is the favoring of debt over equity. That's a big one. And we have all kinds of laws that favor debt over equity. The fact that dividends are not deductible by corporations, but interest is. We do everything we can to do that. And leverage is one of the things that has contributed enormously to inequality. We've chosen a system foolishly that makes it more likely. So I don't know which things in particular you want to change first, whether it's more important to change trusts or the estate tax first, or whether it's more important to change these rules that affect debt and equity, but you got to change them all probably to take on a problem as hard as this one.
The issue of finance is kind of interesting, not only in how it's contributed to accumulate riches in the hands of a few financiers, but also how good it's been at spreading losses amongst the rest of society.
Yes.
I was counting since '87, we have the '87 crash, the SNL crisis,
Yes.
the Mexican financial crisis, the Asian crisis, the internet bubble, Enron, and the housing meltdown. Now that's kind of pretty damaging right there altogether. And so it seems to me that in thinking of the redesign of the financial system, that should be kind of like front and center,
Yes, I quoted Keynes earlier. I'd like to quote another of his countrymen. In 1925, a British statesman said, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." He didn't get his way, but Winston Churchill got his way on a lot of other things. He was a pretty perspicacious figure, and he had it right. We can make finance play the role it ought to play as a lubricant. Sometime before the crash, finance, which when I was young used to get about, 8% of the nation's profits, was up to getting 30-something% of the nation's profits. It doesn't create jobs, it doesn't do research, and 30-something% is just not what you ought to pay to lubricate the rest of it. So I think that's a really important piece of all of this, and I say that as someone who's in the financial sector. I'm not saying that finance is evil. I'm saying that we've set up the system to make it work in a way that's not optimal for the rest of the economy.
Another area that I find potentially promising is the idea of attacking market power, the oligopolization that one seems to see in so many sectors of the economy. And I'm not sure, at one point in your book you seemed a little bit hesitant to say that we are in fact moving to a much more oligopolized economy, but my sense is that the data is pretty solid. If you look at in the medical care sector, the index of concentration is going up. In wireless broadband provision, it's going up. In banking, as you point out, it's going up. So there seems like in a very large shares of our economy, the number of firms that control the market is shrinking. And there's some really interesting theories about how this could be affecting income inequality. You have the first kind of like standard notion that Joe Stiglitz has pushed a lot, which is that this is basically the boosting corporate profits in the capital share of income, and so that is just basically accruing more returns to capital and less to labor. And then there's this other idea that I find very intriguing, that if you have a set of firms that are earning supernatural returns because of their, market power, the workers at those firms will get some, share of these economic rents. And so workers across the economy in different firms are going to get different remunerations, just basically whether they're in a company that has some monopoly power or oligopoly power or not. And these things seem fairly insidious, right? And yet, even though at least on the level of the discourse, we seem to agree that oligopolization is a bad thing, the political enthusiasm for attacking it seems lacking somehow.
Absolutely. This is another wonderful example of what I was saying earlier. The popular will is going to have to drive the political leaders. The political leaders are not going to take us there, because it's just more convenient to be on the side of very powerful interests than it is to oppose them. They will do it only if the public requires it. And something has changed in the United States for the worse over the last 100 years, and that is that there used to be a lot of public suspicion about large corporations. I use the word trusts to talk about the tax laws, but the trusts 100 years ago were these sort of conglomerated financial institutions that owned lots of businesses. And the antitrust laws came out of a swelling of public opinion that there was something wrong with that. I don't think the public feels that way today, but they should. And if the public does come to feel that way again, maybe we can have a real antitrust policy again, which we don't have now. I think Teddy Roosevelt would be just as upset as I said the founding fathers would be if he could see what has happened to antitrust policy. It was a good thing in the United States to have this suspicion, because there's half a dozen reasons or more why too much concentration in industry is bad. And you named some of them, and there are more. It's pretty much all bad. And the public ought to be suspicious, and it ought to want a strong antitrust policy. But that hasn't happened. That's going to take this thing I was describing earlier of ideas winning first and then the politics will follow.
So how did we get, in your view, from there to here? I mean, you posit a moment in our history where, we had, better antitrust policy, better distribution of income, policy that seemed more conducive to more equitable distribution of opportunity and outcomes. And now we're in this, really dysfunctional state. Do you have a narrative, a convincing narrative of how we got into this path and what drove it?
No.
Give it a shot.
All I can tell you is that the biggest, most important inflection points in history are almost impossible to see in advance and pretty hard to explain even after the fact. The little changes in society and in thinking you can explain. The big ones, these sort of big drifts, what caused the rise of Christianity? What caused the rise of Islam? What caused Genghis Khan to be able to assemble the largest empire in the history of the world up to that time? These are questions that, unfortunately, historians seem to be very bad at answering. And I'm afraid that at least I don't have a good answer to what has caused the ebb and flow in the United States, because it's been an ebb and flow. We've been in this direction before, in the robber baron era, the Gilded Age. It's going to be worse now because we've already tied that, and we're still rising in all of these things that I'm afraid of. But it's been a cycle, and I don't think there is, at least I don't have an easy explanation for what causes that cycle. I wish I did.
We'll have to wait till the next book. So now it's, you guys get a shot at asking him questions.
I've come simply to point in one direction or another. We have microphones on both sides. We're going to take questions for about 15 minutes. I think it's a good idea if you go to the microphone so the people in the back can hear you. And please take a moment to tell us who you are. I knew there would be lots of questions.
Gee, I never do this kind of thing. My name is Shelley Grossberg, and I'd just like to pick up on your comment about the engagement of the citizenry in the voting and our democracy, and there has been a steady decline, and I just wanted to suggest that this is very much tied to education and a lack of education about civics in general, and and the quality of education, which is affected by economics. So I wondered if you had a comment about that.
Well, another of the chapters in the book that I wrote is about education. And let me just very briefly say that I'm not very happy with the state of education in the United States right now. When we're measured by international testing standards, I think the last survey I saw ranked us something like 34th in terms of how successful our K through 12 education was. And a really smart guy, I think he was president of MIT at the time, which probably requires you to be pretty smart, said if you could have a Congress of educators from all over the world, they would all vote that the United States had the best graduate school system in the world. And at least half of them would vote that we had the best colleges. But none of them would vote that we had the best K through 12 system. We can fix that. We're the richest, most powerful nation in the world. But we're not fixing it. It's not working terribly well, and at least I believe, and this is where it gets controversial, but I believe that it's not going to work with a one-size-fits-all philosophy that has somehow taken over. 70% of people are not going to go to a four-year college and graduate. We need to give those people vocational and occupational skills that may not apply to the 30% that are going to go to universities and graduate. And that 30%, we need to find a way to make them less broke and poor by the time they get out. We've made it too expensive for them. So the system works great if you're brilliant and rich.
Thank you very much.
point us on, and obviously, Eduardo, feel free to jump in. Let me ask you all to make your questions quick, if you could. We've got quite a queue here.
Hi, I'm a little short. Okay, there you go. My name is Helen Mangano, and I have two things that are an issue. One is, do you think that part of the problem of the wealth inequality is related not so much to individual wealth, the trusts and that piece of it, but sort of something the cat got out of the bag, that there are so many, it's a global issue, there are so many multinational corporations, and the rules are such in the American tax system and tax rate, corporate tax rate is actually one of the highest in the world. And so what's happened is that the corporate and the tax lawyers have structured things so that these baskets and ways that you tax, so that the wealth and even the policy and the law process is not subject to our individual American idealism, because we have multinational corporations with the food issues and, you know, food corporations and multinational corporations. And so on an individual basis, like changing the estate tax or the death tax, is not necessarily going to provide a viable pool of capital. You know, that's my first question, and I know I'm on this side of the line. My second,
Quick,
okay.
please, really.
I'm sorry. Okay, so maybe you can just address that issue.
Sure. And but by the way, if you want to jump in on this, you know at least as much as I do about this kind of issue. Let me say that globalism and multinational corporations, they do good in the sense that the more trade there is in the world, probably the bigger the economic pie for everybody. I think that's very hard to deny. On the other hand, if they create a race to the bottom in terms of regulation and conduct in order to do it, that's negative. And so, like any important, complicated issue, you have to manage it carefully. So my view is you don't want to race ahead and say, let's have, you know, pure globalism. Anybody can go anywhere without any restriction, and you don't want to just jump into that quickly. On the other hand, you don't want to go in the other direction and restrict trade, because you want trade to grow over time if the economic pie is going to grow. So I'm in favor of a middle and moderate course towards free trade. Do you want to jump in on that?
Sort of.
I mean, I would just add here that it is true that as capital becomes more mobile, it becomes more difficult to tax. And this has been used as an argument to, like, let's forget about taxation of profits and let's focus on taxing things that can't move, like, you know, things and people, you know, for their work. And you could make a case for some sort of, you know, multinational agreements that could, you know, catch the capital even if it moves. But we're so far from that right now. I mean, right now, it's kind of like a race to get tax havens to just, you know, disclose the kind of the firms and the profits that go through them. This seems kind of an unrealistic objective. I think that theoretically you could just forget about the corporation and tax at the level of the individual if you could just figure out all the money and avoid the evasion at the level of the individual. But we're also nowhere near doing that properly.
And then my second
Can
thought.
I ask you to hold that? We got 4 minutes.
Just
I'm gonna-
really quick, like Warren Buffett, could I just Warren Buffett and the contribution?
Yeah.
All right, I'm done. Next.
You can ask him later. Thanks. Over here, sir.
Thank you, Jim, for a terrifically clear and consequential book.
That's right.
My question is arcane, but it's very relevant to distribution of wealth, and that's relating to financial crises. And perhaps the most powerful negative impact on net income and net wealth derives from financial crises. We can see it in our own. If you look at Greece today, in the last 10 years, the consumption of the average Greek person has declined by 40%. So you're an expert, or were, on derivatives through your work at the CFTC. Derivatives, you noted, was a problem and could be a big risk years ago. They were a major problem in the financial crisis we incurred. AIG and other issues, what happens if a major counterparty or two fails as in their obligations on the $100 trillion of nominal amount, and I think it's even greater than that? Can the central clearing or central counterparties, are they able to net out all those transactions in a way to avoid a major collapse? And what's your recommendation to fix that?
Well, that one I can give a better answer to than Eduardo's question about why this is happening. Derivatives, and for those who don't know, derivatives are instruments that can be traded, financial instruments that can be traded, that are not tangible but derive from something tangible. So, it's not the share of stock, it's the bet on whether the share of stock is going to be worth more. It's derivative of something else that is a tangible asset. So these derivatives are the worst regulated part of our economy. I think probably Congress gets the lowest marks with respect to regulation in derivatives of anything that it has tried to touch. We don't regulate them at all correctly. As you said, there's hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of them in the world now. Just the 10 largest American banks have over $200 trillion in derivative open positions, and that is 3 times the world's GNP. That is not some kind of commercial hedging. And so we are exposing ourselves to exactly what you talked about. There's always counterparty risk, that is the risk that the other guy isn't going to pay in a derivative. There's always the risk that you got it wrong when you said, gee, I have this derivative and this one going the opposite way, and therefore I'm not at risk. The rules allow all of these financial institutions to net what they consider to be a derivative that would move this way with a derivative that would move this way and count it as zero. And that's wrong. If we made them put up reserves every time they opened a derivative position, then you couldn't get to 200 trillion for the banks or 900 trillion for the world, and we would all be safer and better off. There's just no benefit to it and a lot of potential harm.
You want to? Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is David Bernal. I'm a student at Hunter College. Cities have historically been where social movements have been born, but they've also been the victims of the increasing wealth inequality. So how do cities or municipalities, smaller governments, play a role in bringing around this social change that we so desperately need?
Well, I think that, if we're talking about revolution, then cities certainly have played a bigger role.
You mentioned evolution, and I love that term, so we can go with evolution.
But I think I want to say that I'm not sure that I'm a good enough historian to tell you whether evolutionary change is more likely to arise in cities. Evolutionary change can arise anywhere. So I'm not sure whether cities more than suburbs or rural areas are where the thought can change that brings about political change. Remember, I think the thought has to come first, that the pen is mightier than, in this case, the politicians' positions. And so I'm not sure that cities have a special role in forming that view. They do in revolutions. I'm not sure in evolution, which is what we both hope for. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I have a thought about that, and it touches on that. I think in a moment like the one that we're living in the United States now, where there's a policy paralysis at the very top level, at the national level, there is a very big role for, I'm not saying just cities, but for subnational entities like cities and states and municipalities and so on, as to try new ideas and serve as kind of like labs for policy experimentation. You see that with initiatives like the minimum wage, which has been moving up basically from the local level to create national pressure for a uniform minimum wage. I don't know, we'll see it, but we'll see, you know, things going on in different parts of the country. And same thing with experimentations on other sorts of social policies. Now, I don't know if you get a death tax of 20% out of this kind of bubbling up, but you get some sort of movement when at the top it's totally static and you know, strangled.
So I completely agree with that, but the reason that I hesitate is that a lot of this concentration of wealth that we've talked about is actually most prevalent in cities. That's where you get the big banks. That's where you get the financial institutions that are part of this. So I'm not really sure about cities playing that special role at the top, but in things like minimum wage, absolutely.
Thank you.
Go ahead, sir. Yeah.
My name is Dan Caslow. At the risk of being a little bit presumptuous, I'm going to offer a personal sense of where the inflection point happened. I entered the workforce mid-70s, and there was always an implicit contract that you had with, or the view was, I work hard, I get an advancement, I get more money. Round about maybe 8-10 years later, all of a sudden you heard things re-engineering, downsizing. Friends were now in jeopardy of losing their jobs for the first time through no fault of their own. Concurrent with that was also when we were beginning to hear about LBOs. And I was wondering, I'd like your comment on those two sort of unrelated events, but happening basically at the same time, that seemed to change the whole dynamic, where all of a sudden we heard people making phenomenal amounts of money on these LBOs, taking bad companies, adding to debt, and also the element of the general working population losing their trust with the basic capitalist system that no longer supported the work hard, get advancement. So, thank you.
Well, I think you got the right period of time for when this inflection point occurred, but there were many aspects to it. So, yes, the use of debt in corporate takeovers is one of the things that I've said we have allowed to go too far. We favor debt, and that causes there to be more corporate takeovers than there would be if we didn't. And so, yeah, that is one piece of it, but it's just one piece of it. Also, roughly the same time, you had an explosion in the growth of hedge funds. And I've written in my book that there's no reason why hedge funds should be given the exemptions from disclosure they're given now. You know, the lesson from the 1929 crash was really well understood in the 30s. You need to have less leverage and more disclosure. Only this time, we haven't done that. And so this same period you're talking about is when that began to occur. And then also, even more simply, remember that there didn't used to be giant banks. That's a reasonably recent phenomenon. And so all of these things happened at the same time.
What about the element of trust? And just, I'll leave it at that. That the broken trust that sort of has continued on for the next 35 years.
Yeah, what I would say about that is that it's the same as the angry voter issue, that people do feel that there isn't a level playing field, that they're not getting their share of America's growth and prosperity, and if median income hasn't increased in 40 years, but a tremendous amount of wealth has been created, then that must be to some extent true. And so people have some right to be angry and to feel that they shouldn't trust their institutions as much as they used to. I think that's a reasonable conclusion.
I'm really sorry to say that we are out of time. Eduardo, do you want the last word on either of those questions?
Sure. I would, perhaps consistent with what you just said, I would suggest that there is, in the 1960s, 70s, an important change is kind of like the end of this very special period for the United States, in which American companies essentially ruled the roost without very much competition, and also at a time of enormous demand growth, both from the baby boomers and the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. And at that moment, so that I think that U.S. companies were reaping enormous rents that they could, you know, distribute sort of in some more equitable way with workers and create kind of like a more paternalistic kind of environment for work. And the moment when that's over, once you start having more competition on the international stage, when trade becomes a bigger deal and whatnot, there's much more pressure on corporate bottom lines, and there you start seeing kind of like the pressure to get managers that are lazy, to get them out the door, stop managers paying so high wages and whatnot. It seems this idea that managers are playing with shareholders' money becomes much more prevalent, and so there's a pressure for companies to become much leaner and meaner that then manifests through all this financial engineering in a way. So, but I would say that the role of globalization and competition that ended this halcyon moment of the U.S. From the 40s through the 70s was, and that's it's a weird, when I think about this, it's a weird feeling because it's not like we can recapture this moment. It's positing that this was a unique moment that is very, very difficult to recover, right? Because it had to do with a world economy that looks nothing like it does today.
I want to thank our two speakers. Again, I'm terribly sorry we're out of time. So, before I let you go, let me just say once again, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Eduardo. Jim is going to be out in the lobby signing books, so let me urge all of you to stop by and say hello and pick up a book. And once again, thank you, and thanks for the excellent questions.